Okay, what we're going to do now is we're just going to talk a little bit about how we can increase learning via effective ongoing feedback. So there are a few different things we're going to talk about. First, we'll focus on the importance of feedback. Then we'll talk about how much feedback we should give, how we might want to give that feedback, and the role of attribution theory. Let's begin by talking about the self-regulation process for students. What happens is students must first set a goal, and then they monitor their progress toward that goal. And then, of course, they need to make changes as needed so that they can achieve the goal that they set forth to achieve. So where the feedback comes in is obviously during that second step of monitoring progress towards your goal. The Terrace article that I shared with you really talks about how important feedback is, and basically they called into question whether or not we're treating undergraduates fairly because we do not give them enough opportunities to use feedback that is provided to them and then put that into practice so that they can benefit from that feedback. So we want to think about how we might incorporate either drafts or other ways to increase feedback for students, especially at the undergraduate level, because it really is such an important and critical part of learning. So let's spend a minute talking about how accurate self-assessments are. If students are going to engage in the self-regulation process, then we need to make sure that they are doing so in a way that's based on accurate information. Unfortunately, many students do have what's called an illusion of competence. So in this study that was done by Karpik and Rutgers and Butler, they discovered that students were not very good at knowing what strategies worked best. So if you look over on the right-hand side under the metacognitive predictions, you can see that students thought repeated studying was really the way to go in terms of learning the content. And yet when you look at the actual test, whether it was for verbatim questions or inference questions, the repeated study group really did not do as well as the retrieval practice group. So basically what that means is that we don't always assess ourselves in an accurate way, meaning that we overestimate how well some strategies work and underestimate how other strategies work, such as retrieval practice. This was the lowest one that students thought they did well on, although actually it was the one that they performed the best on. And the big problem really with that overconfidence or illusion of competence is that students may stop studying too soon. So we want to avoid that, certainly, because we want to make sure that students are learning the content that we're asking them to learn. And here's a study by Dunlosky and Rawson, that really shows that overconfidence is associated with poorer performance. So the more overconfident you are, the lower the performance would be. So as a faculty member, how can you help students increase their accuracy when they're making these judgments during the self-regulation process? Well, there are many different things that faculty can do. First of all, there's two different types of feedback that students can focus on. One is cognitive feedback, and that's what they need to rely on during the process of studying. So when they're engaged in completing an assignment or studying for an exam. And then there's the outcome feedback, which is what they should do with feedback that you have formally given them after completing an exam, a paper, a project, etc. So let's talk a little bit about how we can structure our assignments so that they are set up to provide more significant feedback. There are a couple of different ways to go about this. As you can see on the left-hand side, the low stakes to high stakes. Well, we can start by giving them assignments that maybe don't have any grade attached to them at all, so they're really purely based for learning. And then as the semester goes on, we can increase the grade attached to it, thereby increasing the stakes attached to it. Because at that point, they should have developed the skills and all to be able to successfully complete that task. Another approach is we can break down assignments. So we can ask them to give us assignments along the way. In this class, for instance, you have that big syllabus project due at the end, but as you can see, we are building in some of the feedback along the way through our discussions and the learning outcome matrix. We can also link our assignments. So as a faculty member, I often ask students to do a variety of different tasks. And one example in my class is I used to have them do a paper and a presentation that were on different topics. And I discovered that if I actually link those topics to the same, those projects together to the same topic, that can really provide students with much more opportunity to learn from that feedback and put it into practice immediately. So in addition to just asking for a rough draft, by asking students to hand in an individual paper prior to engaging in any group work related to the presentation allows them to get feedback on the content before they're then moving forward to the presentation element of it. Then they can get feedback on, perhaps their slides before they're actually presenting that content to the class. Quizzes are another great opportunity for students to get a chance to know whether or not they're mastering the content. So highly recommends the use of quizzes, especially at the undergraduate level. And there are certainly resources that can help students also. So by providing models or rubrics, we're providing more clarity in terms of what our expectations are, and that can certainly be helpful. Now, of course, the one, the most important downside, I guess, really is that we don't want to stifle creativity, and sometimes it, depending on the nature of the task, can just kind of be a little too restrictive. The students might follow the model too closely or the rubric too closely without really, thinking in a much more broad kind of creative way. So it depends on the nature of the assignment, whether these are effective approaches, but they are certainly resources that may be helpful to your students. Now, if you do provide students with a rubric, you may want to think about asking them to use the rubric in order to engage in self-assessment. So you might ask them to take that rubric that you provided them with and have them grade themselves. That's a great way for them to be engaged in that academic self-regulation process. An outcome of type of feedback is to ask them to engage in post-exam reflection. It could also be post-assignment reflection, asking students to really reflect on what went well, what didn't go well, how they might use that feedback to help them, even if the next big exam they take isn't until next semester, or the big project they do isn't until next semester. So really kind of forcing them to think more deeply about it can be quite helpful. Now let's take a look at how much feedback we give and what might be most helpful to students. You can see here there's an example of a paper that's quite marked up, and we'll talk a little bit about if that's typical of what students are receiving. So Lodkowski really talks about some characteristics that I think are important for you to think about in terms of what is effective feedback. Whether or not you're using a rubric, you certainly want to make sure that you're using some kind of criterion or standard that you're connecting the grade to and the feedback to. Making sure it's informative, which means that there's something actionable the students can do after getting that feedback. And the more specific and constructive it is, the more valuable it is. When we write really global comments like, organize this better, students don't really know what to do with that. So providing them with more specific examples can be helpful. And obviously, the more immediate and the more frequent the feedback, the more effective. Now, feedback is a very complex process. It has many different components to it, and one giant component is the emotion. So it's not just about, cognitively processing all this information, but our relationship with the student and how the student perceives us as a teacher impacts how they'll take in that feedback, whether or not they'll take it seriously, whether they'll take it to heart. Feedback is very emotional. I mean, when we put our work out there, whether it's a paper, an art project, some type of, really any kind of portfolio or project, really we're kind of sharing ourselves and putting ourselves in a vulnerable position, eagerly waiting for that feedback. So we need to keep that in mind as we're providing that feedback. Here are some other feedback principles, and if we were in a live class, I'd have you kind of turn to a neighbor and talk about these different principles. What I'll ask you to do right now is to just take a minute to read them. You can also access these through the shared files to think about them a little bit more, about how you can take those principles and put them into action. Okay, here's a study that was done by Stern and Solomon, and what they did was they looked at student portfolios. So it was really of all their work across their entire college span, and you can see it at almost a total of 600 papers were reviewed. And what they found was that very few of them used a rubric. English faculty did put more markings than non-English faculty, but in general, the comments were very, very similar. I think one of the most important issues here is that you can see the overwhelming type of feedback was really had to do with grammar, punctuation, sentence structure, word choice. So really all the mechanical issues. Whereas more global scholarly advice, the bigger picture feedback was really not happening in a significant way. So what students are getting are papers that are filled with grammatical feedback rather than feedback related to the purpose of the assignment. And I'm not sure that's really what we want to emphasize. It kind of sends, I think, the wrong message. And clearly we need students to function and write and create products that are grammatically correct. But we also have assigned that assignment not just to teach grammar, and that's really what the lesson was, but in most cases it's not the primary purpose. So we certainly do want to provide feedback on those other areas as well. So Stern and Solomon point out that what we say is important is big picture, organization, content, but yet what we give feedback on are the kind of technical, mechanical issues I just described. And when we provide too much feedback, students take that to think that we're not thinking positively about them. So it's important about balancing the amount of feedback we provide. It can be too overwhelming to have too much for students. And many of the students don't really even understand our comments and the reason for them, so we have to be mindful of that as well. So one of the strategies I like to use is verbal feedback. I think that really provides us with an opportunity to answer questions if students don't understand the feedback. Now clearly that takes more time and it's easier to do in an in-person versus an online class, but I do think that whenever you can tuck in verbal feedback, it will improve the nature of the learning process. In addition, we can also think about ways that we can provide students with feedback that may not overtax ourselves. So for instance, if we can't even imagine grading an entire stack of papers 3 or 4 times with different drafts because we have many other responsibilities and it's extremely time consuming to provide that feedback, we can think about ways to provide feedback on just one aspect of the assignment. So perhaps we would just be giving you feedback on the overall organization of the feedback, or just on whether or not you've identified resources that are aligned to the outcome and the assignment task. So we can think about providing just feedback on 1 or 2 elements, and that can be quite helpful. One of the ways I like to increase feedback is through the use of peer feedback, and depending on who your students are, it will vary in terms of how much support they need at being productive peer feedback providers. So Facey really talks about this conveyor belt that I really like, where you ask students to, instead of providing feedback on the entire project, you're asking them to just provide feedback on one issue, such as the main idea, or did they complete the assignment in its entirety, or did they cite sources correctly, things of that nature. The last thing I just want to mention is the role of attribution theory. Mueller and Dweck did this famous study, and it was done with elementary school students, but basically what happened was they had students complete a puzzle that was of moderate difficulty level, and then the experimental part came in with the feedback that was provided to them. After they got this feedback, they then had to do a difficult puzzle, which was designed to set up a failure experience. And what Mueller and Dweck wanted to know is, how did students do at the end of the study on a moderate puzzle after they experienced that feedback? Now, they had 3 different types of feedback. So either they were told, wow, you did really well because you must be really smart, or wow, you did really well, you must have worked really hard, or the control group was just told, wow, you did really well, period. And what they discovered was that the students who were in the effort group, wow, you did really well because you must have worked really hard, outperformed all the other students. So this was really the most important type of feedback. And actually, the ability group was actually doing more harm than good because they performed more poorly. So what this means is we need to make sure that we're helping students interpret feedback productively so that they want to persist on task, so that they have higher levels of achievement and enjoy the learning process. So this certainly is true in college also. I mentioned before that study was done in the elementary school, but there's plenty of studies that also speak to its value at the college level. So our role really is to help students attribute their mistakes to something that is internal and changeable. So as we're providing feedback, we want to think about how we can take attribution theory and apply it to the feedback that we provide. So I hope that you found this to be helpful, and I think it's really important for you to think about how you can take this information and put it into practice.